Welcome to Equipping Leaders, a podcast where I share and discuss resources, tools, and information to equip leaders to build creative, cohesive teams through culture and leader development. Welcome to the Equipping Leaders podcast. I'm your host, Natasha, and today I'm sharing a conversation that I had with Executive Coach Rachel Irvine-Halliday on inclusion, boundaries, and coaching people through difficult conversations.
Good morning, Rachel. I'm so happy you're here. I'm going to start by asking you to introduce yourself and tell us your style of coaching.
Thanks. It's lovely to be here, Natasha. I'm really excited. This is the first ever podcast I've been part of, so yay! My name is Rachel Irvine-Halliday. I am located in Vancouver, Canada. I would say my style of coaching is based on the training that I got. I went through Coaches Training Institute 20 years ago. I looked at my diploma behind me earlier to figure out when did I actually do this. I come from the philosophy of we are all creative, resourceful, and whole. And that as a coach, I am there to support your journey, to hold up the mirror so that you maybe can see yourself a little clearer, ask those curious questions to help peel the onion. But the other thing that I add on that, because I was thinking about the frameworks that you were asking about, I do a combo. This actually was a really good question for me to consider and solidify my sort of coaching ethos and building on the tenets of coaches training, which was we all come creative, resourceful, and whole. We have the answers. Sometimes we just can't see them for the noise or the chaos. The other piece, the framework, is emotional intelligence. I feel like I cannot coach somebody unless we do some unbuttoning of the self-awareness. So it's one thing for, somebody to come and say, I've got this challenge and I'm trying to fix it. I'm not going to go straight, obviously, to help them to problem solving. I want to sort of unpack it a little bit and say, so is this really a challenge? The EI piece is exceptionally important of really building in that starting with the cornerstone of self-awareness and then going from there around, what are you doing in that space that we could unlock that will help you move forward in those challenges.
Emotional intelligence, people love to talk about it. It's like a very buzzy thing to say, but the actual work is really hard work. And I know that you coach people at all levels. And a lot of times we think, oh, well, by the time you get to this level, they've nailed it, right? They've got emotional intelligence down. What have you noticed in where people are in their careers and how that relates to emotional intelligence?
I think, like everything else, it's a journey. I think our levels of self-awareness are dependent on age to a certain degree, but also if we've been brought up by people who know that self-awareness and self-management are things that we need to continually check in on. But I will say with age, and that's not an ageist comment, it's just we build self-awareness by going through things. So again, dependent on your background, because we could go through things as children that has built self-awareness that a 55-year-old would never have. So everybody's different, but the tenets themselves, that exploration, the curiosity, the sitting with self, the reflection, it doesn't matter. But I have noticed that the biggest area, I think, or the biggest demographic, I would say, are senior men in the organizations that I work in. Again, it could be due to levels of privilege that they've had, that they just haven't had to. They've gotten to where they are based on how they show up, and we've lived in a world that has supported that. So there's that element. But I find that once you start talking about it and breaking it down, and this is, I think, one of the differences for me, and I've checked in, I work with lots of coaches in my current organization as well as external. I'm coaching the whole person. So if you bring me in to talk to your leaders, I'm not going to be coaching them around your revenue, your profit and loss. If that's what you want them to improve, we'll get there. But I'm going to talk to the whole person, because I've said this for decades. You don't leave who you are when you literally walk through the doors in the morning. Now, these days we're logging into Zoom. Neither do we leave who we are at the end of the day and just go into our private lives, especially now with Zoom and working from home versus working in an office. That gray area is so much bigger. I coach them from the whole perspective of who are you as a human being? How does that inform your leadership style? And where are the opportunities for us to broaden your learned experiences about others' lived experiences?
I love that. There's so many great things you said in there. So one, I'd like to go back to there's just certain demographics that maybe need a little more help. And I have found that sometimes, for example, in a previous job that I had, somebody would come in, he was senior in the organization, and he would throw what the rest of us would call the temper tantrum about something going on. And instead of someone confronting him, or instead of him being maybe coached around that, we tend to infantilize them. Oh, they're having a bad day. Like, oh, don't like. And so in doing that, I think that we do a disservice to anybody when we do that. But I think especially some demographics, people think they get to a certain place, and either self or external, people are like, oh, well, they're this level, so like we don't say that. You're not above reproach just because you're in any type of a leadership position. In fact, you're more center stage, and all of your actions should be questioned, and you should be able to have a good answer as to why.
Yeah, and modeling. I hold our leaders to a very high bar. If you are leading an organization, regardless of the size, you are probably making a substantial amount of money. You have levels of autonomy, influence, power, and privilege based just on the role that you're in, regardless of what other identities you might be carrying. No, I expect you to model specific behaviors as a leader. And if you let your brain get hijacked, your amygdala get hijacked, and throw a temper tantrum like a 2-year-old, I'm sorry, but you're not doing the job you were hired to do. And I will agree, Natasha, I've watched it. I've coached leaders over the years that have said, well, this is just the way I am. If you don't like this, you know where the door is. I ship da-da-da-da-da-da. I do this. I build that. I create this. I'm like, okay, but you've left your team in shambles. Your attrition rate is out of this world. You've been told you're a rock star way too many times. And you can't hold your cultural background as an excuse for how you show up. I've fired internal clients for this very thing, where I've gone back to my leadership team and said, I know I was assigned this person, they're not coachable. And I've done that 3 times in 20 years. And lo and behold, 2 out of the 3 of those people ended up leaving the organization I was with, being asked to leave. Because again, until we put these types of behaviors as a priority and we measure and hold people accountable, they're going to continue. But what makes me happy and cautiously optimistic is that the generations behind me, because I'm old, but the generations behind me are hearing this and seeing this and actually aspiring to what is my personal philosophy of servant leadership, of being in service. I'm in the role of a leader, and I'm not out in front. I'm with the troops. I'm in the ranks with this group. Yes, I make the decisions, but I'm in there too, digging the pits and doing the work, and also listening. And I find that makes me cautiously optimistic that these are topics that teenagers are hearing about, that our folks in college and universities are talking about in business school now, versus just the bottom line. Regardless of how we get there, that's all that matters. Now we know how we get there matters just as much, if not more. And a lot of that is driven by our consumers. We have high expectations of the organizations that we purchase from. And the generations behind me are way more on top of that than others. And so I think that's going to be a huge shift of holding leaders accountable, saying, you said you were going to do this, you're showing up one way, and even all the way through your supply chain and the way that the organizations run, there's some opportunities for improvement.
And I think when leaders can be authentic, but also understand that like you're not going to get canceled. Everybody's still worried about cancel culture. But I think there's something really powerful, and we've seen it played out in a lot of different organizations where the leader says, I was wrong in doing this way, and I apologize. And to truly demonstrate that I'm sorry, I'm not going to repeat that behavior, right? I've acknowledged and I'm moving forward. And I think there's a lot of space for that. But I really like also that for a long time, there was like this sanctioned incompetence around a lot of things. Like, we're killing the earth, we're treating people terribly, we're doing all these different things for this bottom line, when now there's this really, we don't compartmentalize anymore. So also kind of going back to what you said, where it's like, if it's at work, it's at work, and if it's at home, it's at home. Well, hopefully people can't do that, because that is sociopathic. But when you can bring all those things together and treat the whole person, right? And look at the whole person and the whole organization in that way. And I really appreciate too what you said about generations, because I think if you look back to like Dwight Eisenhower, it was very much like you maybe did service to your country, and then if you gave back, it was in retirement and closer to the end of your life. And then as generations moved on, it was you would kind of give back on the weekends, you would find maybe ways to give here and there. But then with, I would say, the end of Gen Z and kind of moving forward, Gen X and moving forward, they want every day to be a way to make an impact.
Yeah.
Like you said, it's in the products that they buy, and it's in the way that they interact and the way that they want to be treated and seen. And I think that that's really important. And I think it's a really positive growth from we just care about numbers to no, we care about people, right? Leadership used to be about strength, your physical strength. And then it became about what you know. And I think in the future, it's going to be about your heart, right? Who you are and how you interact.
Yeah. This came up in a conversation last week where we were talking about it goes beyond what you're doing internally for your current talent. And we talk a lot about talent. You and I, we know the future of talent, where are we growing it, where are we getting it? But we were also talking about the fact that what are we doing in the communities that our companies are based in? I've worked at companies where they have a fairly big presence in the community, but this was one level of beyond that of if you're a massive global company and you're in 35, 40, 50, 60 countries, what are you doing like in the vicinity of your locations? So plonk a big building in the middle of some city somewhere. And yes, obviously you'll probably be doing something, but what is the plan for your community giving back in and around that space? Because a lot of companies do the upper level kind of corporate social responsibility. Here's what we're going to do global. But this is the on the ground, because it goes to talent. This is where I live. What are we doing? What is my company doing to give back in this location? I continually hear and read more and more about how this is becoming a decision-making factor for many of our young people these days in terms of, okay, it's not work hard, play hard anymore. It's very different. It's, I'm going to work hard and I'm going to also just balance. And I might be okay with not making quite as much money if I know my organization is going to give me time off to volunteer. I mean, we know that traditional motivations are changing. People don't want the 6-bedroom, 12-bathroom house. Give me Wi-Fi and a beanbag. And like that's that different focus. Cars, generations are not buying as many cars anymore. So I think all of those things, I mean, this is a journey for me as well, is how is that changing the shape of the companies we work for?
Absolutely. And you and I have had some of my favorite conversations around inclusion. From your perspective, what is the role of inclusion in coaching and how has that evolved?
Well, I talk a lot about lived versus learned experiences. It's something that I found really helped me shift my own perspective in the journey around, DEI and racism and sexism and all the other isms and systems of oppression out there. I can't coach to somebody's lived experience. From my perspective, there's multi-levels here. Number one, the coach and coachees relationship, coach and client's relationship. So my own connection around inclusion in that space. So what I need to be aware of when I'm going into a new relationship with somebody. So for instance, right now, I've got a mix of genders. I think from a coaching perspective, there's multiple levels of inclusion we have to be thinking about. There's our own journey as a coach. Where am I? How might this show up in relation to my conversation with my clients? So my lived experience is very different than the lived experience of a young woman that I'm coaching who's South Asian, Canadian, American, South Asian, and her journey. So it's just having that sort of gut check and reflection in that space. And then the next space is just, if I'm coaching around inclusion, then there's a specific desired outcome that somebody's identified. So one of the leaders that I've worked with over the last few years realized that he had really big hiring bias, and his organization was very focused on the sports realm. And he'd realized that he'd inadvertently, because it was unconscious, had internalized the message that only men are good at sports and only men would be interested in working in a sports related role. And so over a period of 5-6 years, he slowly built this organization that was predominantly male, between 35 and 50. Racially, it was fairly diverse, but his core was like male. And then fast forward 5 years later, a few focus groups, team surveys, and yeah, this is not a healthy place for women to work. It was basically the feedback. He was devastated. Absolutely devastated, because he prides himself on being a forward thinker, father of 2 or 3 daughters, all very athletic young women. So this kind of was this dissonance that he realized of externally. It was all about driving the female experience through his daughters and making sure that they're empowered and elevated, yet internally he had blinders on. And through the coaching conversation, he started to understand he hadn't quite brought the mindset external into, like it was the combining of, and this is where I'm like, I'm coaching the whole you, not the business leader, not the father, you. And that just helping people understand that. Again, that's the creative, resourceful, and whole. He was already on this journey. He'd already started down it. And again, I'm excited when men, that penny drops when they have a daughter or somebody that they're like, oh, I finally get equal rights. Now I'm being a little bit facetious in that, but better late than never. But I find sometimes that takes a little while to sort of trickle down into the rest of their thinking, because it is very personal. These are the women in my life. I know them, versus I'm running a business and the business is traditionally male and and those voices that we have in all of our heads. So I find that from when I'm coaching to help elevate, I'm really digging in and asking about what else is going on, like taking out the element of the work, but how do you show up in different spaces? Walk me through that, talk me through that. Well, what would you do if your daughter came home and said, Dad, they won't let me play soccer this year because of X? Well, I'd be really upset. Oh, really? So what would happen if your daughter came to you and said, Dad, I wanted to do X in this company, and I went there and I found it was an unsafe place? I coach from the head, heart, and hands perspective as well, as you well know. So if I have to connect with the heart to get somebody moving, then I'll push on that. If it's the head, okay, what do you need to unlearn and relearn? And if it's the hands, what do you need to do differently? I'll coach to all of those. But then the biggest thing I think from there is really helping people get clear on their biases and how those are impacting. Because to me, the biggest and saddest thing is that if we're not aware of our biases, the blockers and the things that we don't ever get to experience, because we're not even looking in that direction or aware.
I appreciate that. And good for that person too, for being open to being coached in that area, because sometimes people will shut down. And you'd mentioned it earlier that there are just some people are just not coachable. No one is beyond coaching, but some people are not coachable.
Yes.
And, Harvard Business Review did an article about that a few years back. But in your experience, what is the difference between someone being not coachable versus having a lot of biases that are really preventing them from moving forward?
I think it comes down to entitlement and privilege. If you have led a life of privilege where there's literally no doors in front of you, you just keep walking through this path, you build up a sense of entitlement that the way you show up is fully acceptable because there's nothing pushing back against it. And that is an extremely hard thing to undo. I'm not saying it's impossible, because I've seen people shift when their ego and their id is tied so deeply to the journey and where they're at, and holding on to that sense of self and their perceived power. Really hard to move them. Really hard to move them. One person that I can think of, he really rooted himself in, this is almost verbatim, "This is how we are in Texas, and if you don't like it, there's the door. I'm a big guy, I'm loud, and I throw things, and if my team doesn't like it, there's the door." No, your team doesn't like it. You've had 10 people quit in the last month. Don't you think you might need to adjust? No. I gotta hire 10 new people. I don't care if I see extracurricular activities on a resume. Out. You need to be 200% committed to this job. There are certain people, I truly believe, that are so stuck in their sense of self and their idea of who they are that it can be almost impossible. I don't believe it's a waste of time trying to coach somebody there, but I also believe that at a certain point, they're just not ready. I think so. I do think that privilege and entitlement definitely plays a huge role in it. And then there's just the difference is that people are ready. Like something has touched them, either in a light way. I say that the universe nudges us gently for a while, and then it just comes and smacks us upside the head to pay attention, whether it's your health, your life, like all of those, like, I really should think about doing that. I should think, oh, maybe I'll, and then all of a sudden something happens, you're like, oh no, I need to pay attention now. Those are the people that I really like working with, because they've come to this space on their own, and they know that they can't get any further without what I like to think of as the collective support. And it's not just me. Like, I tell every person that they should have their own pit crew, mentors, coaches, advisors, any partners, thinking partners, knowledge partners, your coffee klatch where you just get to complain, like we all need that, because again, and this is something that has become abundantly clear, and I have been very, very blessed to have learned so much over the last decade from a lot of extremely wonderful Black women. And one of the things that I've taken away over the last, like I said, decade, is none of us gets to where we are alone. And I find my background, my culture is very individualistic. Got here on our own, I pulled myself up by my bootstraps, that kind of theory, story narrative that we say. And what I've learned from watching and listening and just being in the presence of, I found that my Black African-American female friends have shown me and highlighted that none of us get to where we are alone. And that in itself is a super powerful space to be in.
Yes. And it's so funny when you say that, because I know many people who do that as well. And there's some things that we just take for granted, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, oh no, my mom didn't have me. Nobody raised me. Nobody ever gave me a job. No, and it's like, no, like all these things happen.
All these things
around us. Yeah. These are people who are providing opportunities and creating an environment for us to be successful, no matter how much credit we do or don't give. They're still there. It still happens.
Yeah, and I do believe that, and I'm sort of generalizing, but North American culture, and I'm including Canada in the US, maybe not so much Mexico, but North America, Canada and the US, it is that individualistic, independent sort of mentality. And I, having lived and traveled many places, we don't have that same sense of community that many other cultures do, the looking back and pulling forward. And that's something that's really shifted for me, partly because I don't have a huge family And I realize, like, as I look around and I think of the people who have impacted me, where I am is not solely based on all the work I've done. That's an extremely freeing place to be. And it's also a really, well, obviously gratitude. big bucket of gratitude.
Sean Achor, in his book, Big Potential, he was talking about kind of something similar where for the first 20 or so years of our lives, everything is so focused on individual achievement. It's like, you got good grades, you did this well, you, and like your development. And then all of a sudden people are dropped into the workplace and it's teams, like, and you have to work in teams. But we've spent so long focusing on individual achievements that sometimes, like I said, people hold on to that. Mm-hmm. Like, I'm a high achiever, that's who I am. And I hate work, quote unquote. I hate working in groups. I hate doing this. It's like, well, that's life. That's the real world. And it's that power of the group that creates an unstoppable force, right? One person is not, but the group is.
Yeah, I've had people say that to me before. I definitely noticed that with young talent coming in the door. They've been high achievers, they've been high potentials, and now they come into a whole organization full of the very same people. And it's a struggle, in that mental space of, oh, wow, I'm not as special, and now I have to work with groups. I always say, what was the first group you were ever part of? And it takes people a bit of time to think about your family, you're used to working in a group. And it's funny how we forget that, because it's just fascinating. So family is the first group we're ever part of. So when you say you don't like to work in groups, I'm going to call you on that, because you worked in a group probably till you 18 at least, if you were living at home until the end of high school, and then you go into another group if you went to college or university and you lived in a dorm, you're part of groups there, and all of those things, like you played football or soccer, part of a group. Again, it's that mirror in coaching of, so what do you see in this mirror? Because what's reflecting back?
Because it's not formal, because we don't call it a group, we're like, no. You're like, you had many siblings. You never talked?
Yeah. You never negotiated who was going to do what chore, or who was going to run interference with mom or dad, or who was going to walk the dog, or all of those things. Like, I only have one sibling, and I think about all the negotiations we did. Dad's going to be home. We have to get the house clean before. Who's going to do it? You do it, and I'll take this. And yes. You worked in groups.
So in the inclusion space,
yes,
how have you seen leaders evolve, I would say specifically over the past 5 to 10 years?
The one story that I already told about the leader realizing that he had inadvertently, unconsciously been hiring all men, that one is a big one. Similarly, I've watched, and I know I don't want it to feel like I'm picking on older white men, but that's where I've seen some of the biggest shifts. And when I say older, I'm thinking 45 and up, but it's really around the learning. And again, I'm going to go back to the lived versus learned experiences, because I think that language alone helps unlock things for people. And I try and ground my clients in, okay, so let's talk about your lived experience, like as much as we detail as we can think about, like identity wise. What about this one? Because this isn't your lived experience. Anything that you learn about this experience. I've watched their understanding transform of the different lived experiences. The one thing that I think is so important is that they slow down. Slow the heck down. And I know it's really hard when you're working for a Fortune 500 or a Fortune 100 and your stock prices are, constantly, and the market's on your back and your CEO's breathing down your neck saying, are we going to hit those goals for this quarter? I personally, my philosophy is, there's 3 core things that we look at from a business perspective: people, process, and product. Your people help inform your processes, and your people help build your product. So if you're not paying attention to your people, the other 2 are probably not going to run as smoothly as you really hoped in order to achieve your goals. So when I think about that, I'm wanting them to think about the humanity of their talent pool. I've seen leaders who have stopped, paused, listened, leaned in, paused again, asked more questions, looped back, all in the respectful context of, I'm asking these questions because I, as a person of power and privilege in this organization, want to remove barriers, change the experience for others. 3 years ago, I had a senior leader in an organization almost frothing at the mouth in a room of 15 other senior leaders about the uselessness of using pronouns. It's ridiculous. It's not the small stuff we need to be bothered about in this DEI space. I want to be thinking on the big KPIs and the big goals. And to today, where that same person is in front of and has been the conversations around belonging and psych safety in his organization, and has stood up in front of his leadership team and said, I owe you folks an apology for some of the behaviors that I have exhibited over the last few years, raising my voice when somebody disagrees with me, the pronoun situation, that was the beginning of a journey for him. And so you see this, and honestly, nothing makes me happier. He's still got lots to learn. I've still got lots to learn. I'll never know it all. I think anybody who either works in DEI or moves over to work in DEI has to be comfortable with that, because your whole world, your whole mindset, regardless of where you start, slowly gets dismantled. And you have to be open, curious, and deeply reflective. A moment for me was when one of my previous managers, Black woman, had said, just turned to me one day and said, Rachel, how often do you think about oppression? And I seized up in the moment, and this was probably five and a half years ago, going on 6. And in the moment I had a panic, and I felt like it was a trick question, and it wasn't, but that was my, perspective. And I was like, no. And she's like, I think about it all the time. And I was like, of course I thought about it, but in the way that she was asking, I knew I didn't think about it. It was external to me, regardless of whatever oppression I may have had, in my own life. It was like, no, and I think about that all the time. Like, it was a shift when we talk about coaching. It wasn't a coaching moment, but for me, it was this is your personal coaching moment, Rachel, like going forward. It's those little things that people drop and you're like, oh. But it's the patience and grace, and for me, it's going in with humility. I don't know what I don't know. I'm here to learn, and I think if leaders can go into that truly curious mindset in the space of inclusion, move away from their own narrative. This is my story. I'm going to put it over here for a bit. I'm going to focus on this. Put aside I'm at this level, I know everything, because this is not about business. The impact is on business, but it's not about business. It's about how we treat people. My goal in life is just literally to inspire people to grow. Continue to grow. Don't be put off. Don't let anybody tell you that you can't or you shouldn't do something. And everybody can have a successful career based on their definition of success. And if leaders are not creating the right spaces and cultures, then they're not doing their jobs as far as I'm concerned. You might be making billions of dollars, but if you're leaving your people in tatters, then no, you're not a leader. That has been a hard message for me to share with some people over the years, but how we show up, there's what we do and how we do it. And so many of our organizations just focus on the what. What are we doing? What are we impacting? What are we achieving? Versus how are we doing it? And I think in the next 6 to 18 months, we are going to go through a global talent reckoning based on us coming out of COVID or moving into the next phase of COVID, whatever that looks like, the return to office work that is now, conversations that are now being held, and the last 12, 15 months of people reflecting on what good looks like for their lives. And I'm kind of excited personally, because you see these articles coming out these days, the last couple of days, about returning to the way it was. And so many people are saying, is that really what it should be? We shouldn't maybe, let's use this as momentum. and let's think differently about our teams and how we support and how we work. That's exciting for me because I think we're due.
I remember being in a meeting several months ago, probably like mid-COVID, and one of the people who was giving us our inspirational message at the end before we went about our day, he made this really great point that due to COVID, we cleared our calendars. Everything that was so important to us was removed from our calendar.
Yeah.
Just to be really thoughtful when you go and you start to put things back on it, is that really important? And I think that of the things that have resulted from COVID, one of the good things is that people are really realizing what's actually important to them and not what we say is important just because that's life, right? You have to go to work. You have to do these different things. When people can not only say what it is they want and then be acknowledged, and companies can help make that part of the solution and part of the way forward and the new way that we work, I think that's going to be really important. And I think you brought up a great point too about like letting people show up how they are in the workplace. And so my friend Vanessa Tennyson, she's an amazing executive coach, and she wrote a paper in which she identified this triad of discovery. And in her research, she found that people who were out and part of the LGBTQ plus community who were out at work actually performed much better. They were much closer to their teams versus people who were not. It was like 54%, like some insane amount of productivity and engagement. Some people, when they get frustrated about like, oh, well, there's this identity or there's that, and it's like, why does it matter to you? It doesn't change you or what yours is, so that's fine. And if it does, explore it. But otherwise, let people be who they are. It does not impact your well-being to let somebody say, oh, I would like to be they, them.
Yep, it has nothing to do with you. And I mean, I was lucky enough this past year to do some work with Dr. Vivian Ming as part of a program that we were running. And an amazing story behind Dr. Ming and her journey through transition and the experiences of being both genders. And she said something that just, I think, struck our audience at the time, but also struck me as a good reminder. She had students that were coming in and saying, I want to be referred as they, them, she, they, Z. And she said one day somebody came in and said, my pronouns are Z. And in her head, she's like, oh, for the love of, and in that moment, she caught herself because her thinking I've spent my whole life just wanting to be referred to she, her. And now, I'm also struggling with all these different pronouns. And it was just really fascinating because she brought it right to the point that you made of, it doesn't matter. It does not matter what I think. If it's so important to this person, that's what matters. How big of a difference does it make to you? And I encourage people when they slip up just to say, oh, it's right. Like getting more comfortable. But to your point, being out at work, we talk about the backpack of bricks that you carry with your identity. It was a colleague of mine, an African-American woman who helped me understand the backpack of bricks, the burden that she carries and brings into work and can't put down, and how that and now for me again, I got another lesson of what is it that we carry with us that impacts our abilities to be creative and innovative. And if I'm not feeling my authentic self or don't feel like I can have that or show that, then there's energy that's going into keeping that contained that's not being able to be shared across the mind. I think it's extremely powerful. But I don't believe that we're there yet, to your point earlier around, woke corporations. We all talk about, regardless of what organization we work with, if you're in this space, we're talking about, bring your authentic self to work, bring your whole authentic self to work. Okay, you said I could. And I think that's where companies are going to have to continue to do their own reflection of, hey, this is not as easy or simple as it was before, because now we're encouraging people to bring that. And with that comes the complexity of the human condition.
Yes, we want people to be their authentic whole self, but we also demand that it be their most evolved self. And sometimes we forget that it's a journey. Like you said it earlier, it is all a journey. And so, yeah, making space for, but also calling people out when they are not being appropriate in this space. And that can be for anybody, right? Some people everybody can be overbearing in their own way. So how do we make it so that every person is included, even if statistically they have always been the most included group of people, making it so that everybody feels like they can be part of it while no one feels like they have to shut down.
Exactly. And that, I think, is the meeting where they're at. So depending on identities, backgrounds, whatever it is that we're connecting with, we can have the space for all conversations. I've had more conversations in the last few years with senior white men saying, I'm worried about how I'm showing up. I'm worried about what to say. Somebody I coached for years, who's very senior in an organization, came to me and said, I don't know how to talk to women anymore. He's like, well, I'm worried I'm going to say something. I'm like, well, what's changed? He's like, well, I'm just more aware. I'm like, okay, well, that's a good thing. I said, but were you ever the kind of person that said inappropriate things before? And he's like, no. And I know this person, an incredibly wonderful, gentle man. I'm like, so why are you worried now? And he's like, well, because I'm just hyper aware. Okay. It's not a bad thing, but it's now impacting and stallers and blockers. So how do we meet people where they're at and have the safe space for them to explore it, where we're removing some of the fear? And that's the thing that I find most common in a lot of the spaces, and I'm seeing it happen globally at different levels. The fear and paralysis. I'm aware that there's a whole bunch of things I don't know. I'm not sure what they are yet, and I'm wading into a space that makes me feel really uncomfortable. Maybe there's a spotlight on me by virtue of my identity for the first time ever. And that's the other thing, is that for the most part, and again, I'm generalizing, but most people, white people, don't have to justify their identity. We don't have to justify our existence in the same way as people of color, Black, African American, Indigenous, South Asian. And I think that's something that really rattles a number of people, is that first time that you've got to look at your identity on that race piece. And I think that's an extremely uncomfortable place. Whereas we know for young children of color, that starts very early about how that manifests and impacts their lives. So again, it's the fear, but I'm a big believer in the fact that I'm not going to treat white people as if they're fragile. If the experience of our Indigenous people of color, our Black, BIPOC communities is such that they have to wade through this on a minute by minute basis, then the least we can do is spend a little time going, okay, this is uncomfortable.
People feel so challenged to their core when they get called out for these different things. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting, I don't remember who said it, but there's a quote that says, it was Joseph Grenny. He said, people are less concerned with what you said, and they're more concerned with why you said it. So immediately there's a challenge to yourself that if somebody says something and you respond a certain way, like why? Like, why are you so upset about somebody telling you a perception that they have?
Yeah.
May or may not be true. Just listen, just let it land, and you don't have to absorb it. This is 100% showing up. Confrontation is hard, but when people can show up and know that when someone has crossed a boundary, that they could say it, but then also know that not only can they say it, but that other person will hear it. We are 10,000 years away from that, but that would be the ideal situation.
And that requires commitment and attention. And that I find in the moving at Mach 10 through the corporate day is what sometimes gets left outside the meeting. But to your point, I think about those moments that we all have to go through where something cracks in the identity. And I look back at some of the things that I've learned and I just shake my head and like, I can't believe I said that. I've lived a privileged life. I've traveled. I've been in many different countries. But I remember 10, 15 years ago when I was talking to somebody and we're talking about being a minority. And in my incompetence and ignorance. They were sharing a story of being Black and Canadian. Family came here 300 years ago. They're part of the Canadian backbone, and just talking about their experience of growing up on the East Coast. And I, in my ignorance, said, well, I know what it's like to be a minority. Now, I can speak to it in some spaces as a woman in tech, but as a grand statement, no. And I was using the example of being in South Africa as a white person, or living in the area that I live in, where I live in it's a very huge South Asian population. And I am literally a minority. But in that moment, and luckily the person I was talking to, trusted partner, was like, it's not really the same, Rach. And I use those as examples to share with people, like, look, this is what it can sound like and look like as we stumble our way through this. And as long as you're okay with the fact that you're going to stumble, and sometimes you're going to mess up, and sometimes you're going to have to beg forgiveness and say, I didn't know what I didn't know. I know now. I will do better. That's the only way forward. But you have to this is the comfort with discomfort. And we have to shine a light on those parts of us that we don't necessarily want to, but it's so freeing. It's so freeing, and it opens you up to exploration. I challenged somebody last week in an inclusion coaching session, an introvert, senior leader, not a joiner. So I totally get that. I'm a connector, not a joiner. So I'm like, okay, so let's find ways for you to connect in a way that feels comfortable. And I basically gave him a list of 15 different Instagrams that I had challenged him to go and follow, check in on them every day for a week to 10 days, and come back with 3 key things that he's taken away. And it was of various groups, women, people of color. We're in Canada, and so I said residential schools, our Indigenous population. But those are little things. And in that space, like, I'm super excited to see what he comes back with based on some of these. And I said, okay, and you find me 5 more that you're going to share back with me. That's not hard. This is stuff that somebody can do on their own, sitting on the couch with their phone. It's not heavy work. All I'm asking you to do is spend a little bit of time looking at different content. And we live in such a content-rich world now that there's no excuse for you not to diversify your content. And if that's the only thing you're willing to do right now, I will take it and run with it, because that alone, if you're on, Instagrams, the Missing Women, Indigenous, Killer Mike, if you're on Keisha Bottoms, if you're on AOC, like all of that's still, it's data, diverse data that you're going to be taking in, and you will be internalizing, and you will think about that. Even on an unconscious level, when you're in a meeting, you're like, oh, I didn't realize I've got so many Latinas in my team. It's just helping people move their own needle a little bit.
You're right. It's such a low risk, easy thing to do. It's literally you just investing time to care about the perspective of somebody else. And hopefully, like you said, you can use that as a force for good. There are so many great content creators.
Oh my gosh.
Educating in such unique ways.
What I'm trying to do now in my own reading, and I read a lot of fiction. I went through 15 years of reading nothing but leadership and anti-racism, and I've taken the last year to sort of go, I'm going to take a breath, but I'm slowly getting back into reading nonfiction again. But one of the things that I want to do is read more stories of people's experiences. I've got the Big Potential up on the screen that we just talked about. Those are great books, but I want to learn, where did you start? What did you do? What did you overcome? What were your wins? And where are you today? And those are the stories that I love. So I've been going through a lot of my Instagrams that are posting books. Barack posted his book list last week. Took a screenshot of that. I'm like looking it against my Kindle list to see which ones I've already read and which ones I should add to it. Another great person on social is Blair Amani. Her videos are phenomenal. and I've shared them with folks I coach as well. Like the way she presents them, the way that the content is delivered, it's engaging, and I think she does a wonderful job of it. That's the positive side of social media. And I can find really good examples of people pushing back against multiple systems of oppression.
You have recommended some great folks to follow on Instagram. What other resources would you recommend to people who are just getting started and just trying to reach out and learn something different?
Social media, definitely. If you are lucky enough to have a diverse group of people that you have access to, whether it's friends, partners, colleagues, people in your teams, ask them for recommendations for books and social media. Do not go to them and ask for a full breakdown of the history of cultural oppression. We don't want that because it's not on them to educate you. I'm always going to say that. Ask for recommendations from other people. That's a big part of it. That's what I did. I reached out to a bunch of my friends and said, what are some of the social media folks you follow that I may not or I may not have ever even come in contact with? And so that's been super helpful. There's exercises, like thinking about the diversity of your world. Documentaries. I'm a huge documentary fan. There's tons and tons. The content, and I will say that Netflix has done an amazing job of elevating diverse content. And again, this is for the white people out there. Listen. This is not your space. You have to listen. No grabbing the mic. No coming and telling a story about, well, there was this one time where I know what it feels like to be a minority because I was the one white person at a party. I know oppression. No, you don't. Not in this space.
Where can people find you to learn more about your work and any upcoming projects or fun stuff you have going on?
I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on Insta, although it's really hard to find me. But if you really want to find me, you can find me, or you can find somebody who knows me and we'll connect. My company is called Brainbox Consulting. I've been doing some consulting work up here in Canada for the last couple of years. My focus for the most part has been on elevating our HR, DEI knowledge and capabilities. So I do some work with companies, but really it's around elevating the overall collective knowledge because, as you know, a lot of times when we're in the inclusion, diversity, equity space, it does fall to our HR teams to support and drive. And so one of the things I've been doing is I've been partnering with a couple of development organizations up here to help build this next small army of change agents, inclusive change agents.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Equipping Leaders. All of the resources mentioned in this episode can be found on my website, natashacheyenne.com. On the website, you can also find a weekly leadership journal entry, a resource page with challenges and downloadable content, a place to sign up for my weekly newsletter, and an upcoming leadership platform full of workshops. You can also follow me on Instagram at novel_Natasha and on Twitter and Facebook at Natasha Cheyenne. If you'd like to hear more about a specific topic, please reach out and let me know. Join me next week for another episode.